being an investment advisor was to understand where people were, understand what their risk tolerance was, to deal with a couple where one has a very high risk tolerance and the other a low risk tolerance. So here you can see it more easily. Here's the S&P 500 on top and the two funds down here so that you can see over time that risk and return relationship. Now I want to talk about adding money. Let me see how I'm doing on my time here. Okay. I want to talk about accumulating wealth for retirement. And I want you to have a really good plan on how you're going to get where you're going. I think most people who are Choose FI members or FIRE movement members know how much they want. They have a number that will allow them to retire. Now, whether that's with enough or more than enough, we'll need to talk about that in a minute. But right now, I want to talk about the accumulation period. And I want to talk to people who are just getting started for a second or early in their career. It's a tough time to be a beginning investor. You have a picture filled with hope. And you know the picture is just wildly made up because now you have nothing invested or very little, and yet you have figured out you need millions or you need a lot of money in order to have enough money that when you take 4% a year, if that's your goal, that it's going to be enough. And it's hard for a first-time young business person, and I want to call them a business person because the stock market and a Roth IRA, I mean, what a wonderful combination to be able to compound profits over a lifetime and take money without any tax at the end and be able to leave money without any tax at the end. I mean, it's an amazing opportunity, but it is just building a business. And every one of us, I started the Merriman Wealth Management company with $15,000. I never personally put any more money than that into the company. I put a lot of sweat equity into the company, but the bottom line is I started with very little, and I wanted it someday to be worth something. I had no idea whatsoever. But I do know this, that in the early years, it is hard to feel the excitement of the progress you're making. But you are about to go as an investor in the stock market. You are about to go into a partnership with the stock market. You are in the beginning, you are definitely a senior partner. You put in $1,000, $83.33 a month for the year. And at the end of that first year, you are who have made the difference, not the market. Here we can see that. Here's the S&P 500 as the equity asset class, okay? And let's just assume for the sake of this discussion, we're going all equities, particularly for the first 20 years. That would not be unlikely for a young investor. At the end of that first year, having invested $83.33 a month, at the end of that year, the value of the portfolio was $1,022. So you are responsible for $1,000 of the net worth of your company, and the market that you had hoped for so much help from did not help a lot. It left you with $22 more than what you put in. Now, this assumes, and I hope you'll consider it, that each year you will add 3%. Add 3% so that in the second year you're going to invest $1,030. So that will be a little more than $83.33 a month. And at the end of the second year, you have now put in a little over $2,000, and the value is $2,275. You really more than likely don't have any idea how that looks in terms of what you're hoping for in the future. But I can tell you this, at the end of the first 10 years, it was not, remember the 70, the 79, the compound rate of return, I think was 5.4% for the S&P 500. You have put in over $1,000 and the market has contributed 6,245. Let's just round it off and see that's what it was. It was actually less. I mean, you made 50% on the money you put in, approximately. And that would be 5% a year if you want to look at it like that. Not compounded, but I mean, it was just not a great period. In fact, you may not have thought you made the right decision. But by the end of the next 10 years, you're down here to almost $120,000. And your last year's contribution was 1,754. Now we're talking. Now you see how the market works. Now you're wishing you put more money away in those early years. And at the end of the next decade, not in having any idea what was going to happen next, you're up to almost $700,000 based on your starting value of $1,000 a year. That last year you put in 2,357. You're going to have put in a lot more money than that. But this at least gives you some sort of a sense. And I will tell you how people felt. In 1999, surveys showed that for the next decade, people were expecting a 20 to 30% compound rate of return. Why? Because we think linearly and we have a huge recency bias. And from 1995 to 1999, the market took off like a rocket and compounded at 28.5%. That sounds like a good number to me. That's my projection. In fact, after putting away a lot of money over the next 10 years, you ended with less money than you started that decade. You did not get a 20 to 30% compound rate of return, or 10 to 15, or 0 to 10. You lost 1% a year. Now, this is the risk of having all of your money in one equity asset class, that you will be in it when it has its terrible period. And they all do. Here's the two-fund strategy. Instead of 16,000, 23. Instead of 120,000, 170. Instead of 699, 871. Instead of 666, $1.3 million. And in essence, going back to that table I showed you, taking about the same risk. Now, there will be years, certainly, that small cap value will do worse. In fact, we showed you that when we showed you that table that showed the small cap value in S&P 500. Now, these tables are so valuable. They are kind of a flight simulator, if you will. And here's what I'll guarantee you. I will guarantee you the future returns of the market will look just like the past. I guarantee it. I have no idea what they'll be day to day, year to year, but I can guarantee they'll be up and they'll be down. They'll be for reasons you didn't expect. They'll be for reasons you did expect. They'll be at the time, they'll be doing well at the time that you're not doing so well, and it'll be doing poorly at a time that you're doing well. I mean, the future is going to look like the past. In fact, if you did nothing but look at the year-by-year returns since 1928 and you didn't know anything about history, you would have no idea there was a place there was a cell phone and there was a place there wasn't, or there was a place there was a war and there was a place that there wasn't, or there was a place that there was a computer and the place that there wasn't. It's just up and down, a little, a lot. Nobody knows, which is why a lot of diversification is wonderful. Now, if you have the ability to invest more aggressively and money-wise, you could get. In fact, if I look down here at 40 years, at that, or all the way to the bottom, if you went all the way from 1970 through 2023, you will have invested $131,000. And it'll be worth $7 million in that two-fund strategy. It's about half that with the S&P 500. If I looked at 60-40, the bottom line number is 2.8. So it's about half less, okay? Now, that's the bad news. The good news is the difference in return is huge. I mean, difference in volatility is huge because the 60-40 was about 40% less risky. So if you doubled up on your investments but took a more conservative strategy, you'd end up about the same place without all the big losses on the downside. And you'll be able to go back. You'll be able to go back and look at the fine-tuning table and see the 60-40 table and what it looked like during the years the market was bad. You can use these tables together to create what it would look like a lifetime of investing for most of us. But the key is, early in this period, it is really difficult to have a sense that you're on your way, you're doing what you need to do. And you lose sight of the fact that if the first 10 years were terrible and all you did was dump your good money into a diversified portfolio of unproductive equity asset classes, that you will now have more shares of all of those companies when the market turns around and goes up. And please understand, this is a faith-based industry. All those people that talk like they know what's going to happen, that's a faith. That is not knowledge. It's knowledge about the past. But there were Confederate bonds that you can't liquidate today. And who knows what the future will bring. That is the part that's difficult. I would be much more aggressive in pushing people to invest if I knew for sure how it was all going to turn out. Let's talk about taking money out. Many of you are on a road to getting out as soon as you possibly can. Get me out of here. I want to retire, you say. And so you try to figure out, when do I have enough? Well, when you have enough is going to kind of depend on how much you're going to take out. Because if you're going to take out 3% and you have a certain amount of money that you need, you're going to have more or less in the portfolio than if you're going to take out 4%. So I want to talk about helping you think through when you retire with enough. Now, for those of you who are going to retire with more than enough, I mean, a lot of people want to retire so they can take out 4%. So they finally get there. They get to their $1 million, and that gives them their 40,000, according to the studies. And we'll look at a study like that. But there's another way to cook this goose, and that is to overcook it. Have twice as much money as you really need. And you might say, as somebody wants to retire at 40 instead of 70, as I did, you might say, who cares if you have twice as much money if you worked for all those extra years to get it? What kind of a decision is that? Well, if you love what you're doing, there's nothing wrong with it. And the fact is, it's a great defense against the unexpected. I'm going to be pulling numbers from the Sound Investing portfolios. We have all of these tables for every one of the portfolios. I'm going to be, in this particular case, looking at the S&P 500 and the two fund strategy. Again, I want to compare them in terms of taking distributions as the equity part of the portfolio. I don't care if you're all equities or 10% equities. I want you to tell the difference between what your equities look like. So here's another table. Daryl has to update, I think, over 200 tables every year. Notice the title, fixed distributions, that what we're talking about, a certain amount coming out, in this case, 40,000. We've called that a conservative strategy because that's a strategy a lot of the industry believes could be usable, would work in whatever equity portion you have, the S&P 500 or the total market index. We're going to start with $1 million. Now, if you're not starting with $1 million, you're starting with 500,000, no problem, divide the number by 2. If you're starting with 2 million, no problem, multiply the number by 2. This is a good round number, easy to figure out different amounts. And by the way, we have a lifetime investment calculator that helps you actually put your own numbers in, so you can do your own testing. That's free as well. Okay, now, and it's, by the way, it's right in the process of being updated. So if you're going to use it, would you just give it a month and you'll have all the latest. So here's the S&P 500. This is the benchmark here. Here is the benchmark with expenses taken out. But what you'd see is that if you went all equities in retirement, that by 1974, you would be down, having taken out $40,000 the first year, and every year it goes up by inflation. 40 goes to 42,278, which goes to 43,697, the consumer price index, which is right here. Okay. You can see that you would have gotten to down to $1,718,000. And you're looking at your spouse and say, yeah, I don't know what to do. I don't know whether to bail out or stay the course. But if we go any further, we're going to have to move in with the kids. I mean, these are really tough decisions to make. If you were 60-40, by the way, notice at the end of the 10 years, you ended with 1.2 million approximately. Versus if you were in the all equity, you'd have under $1 million. And in 1974, you would end with 906,000. In other words, remember I said early on, defense, defense, defense. And when you're in retirement, there's a lot of reason to be defensive. I don't mean you should be all in fixed income. As a matter of fact, I want you to notice that eventually, the all bond portfolio here runs out of money. When there's no numbers down here at the bottom, you're broke. But notice, if you went 30 years out, you were okay whether you were here with the 60-40, ended up with almost 6 times what you started with, and you took a lot of money out. And the S&P 500, you would not have had that much more. You would have had 6,000,004 versus 5,000,009. Whoa, you know something? I'd take the 60-40 if I knew that was going to happen. And here you can see the 60-40 with the two fund strategy. You go out here to 30 years, it's at at $12.7 million with the 60-40 versus the 5.9. Huge advantage. And by the way, you haven't even run into 2000 through 2009, because look what happens to the S&P 500. From 2000 to 2009, it goes from starting with $6.5 million down here to, pardon me, $3.9 million. Down a third. Versus the 60-40 with the two fund strategy was at 18, almost $19 million, up from 12. Anyway, that extra diversification is huge. Now, what we haven't done yet, and we might, I think Daryl will get a gun after me if I ask him for this, but there may be a time when we have done these two fund strategies for 50-50, 40-60, 30-70, so that you could consider using a combination of the S&P 500 and a smaller amount of the small cap value. And you can be really, really conservative, and instead of taking out 4%, you take out 3% of the starting amount and up it by the CPI every year. Everything goes to the bottom. And by the way, when you get out 30 years, you got a ton of money in the S&P 500. You got 16.5 million because you started with 30,000 instead of 40. Before, you remember, you ended up with about 6.4 million, taking out 40,000, adjusting for inflation. And now, if we look at the 30,000 using the two fund strategy, now you've overlaid multiple levels of defense, but the 60-40 now is worth about almost $20 million. And the all equity is worth about $35 million. And again, we don't know what the future will look like, but I do know this: you will make decisions by design or by default, by choice or by chance. And the reason that we work with so much math and historical evidence is to try to create a better understanding of what the implications are of those choices. You want to make a bad choice? Decide to take 5% out of that S&P 500. Remember, you made it to the bottom of almost all of these columns. But when you go up to 50,000 a year with the S&P 500, starting with 50,000 and adjusting for inflation. Now, by the way, nobody sits there and just lets this happen. They change their lifestyle. But I'd rather you not change your lifestyle. And I even show tables at 60,000. Now you might say, why do you even waste your time doing that? Well, you'll see when I talk to you about flexible distributions, when you retire with more than enough, huh? I love that. More than enough. And that's what my wife and I did. I didn't have to work the extra years, but I not only liked what I was doing, but I liked the idea that we would be positioned that if we wanted to be aggressive and take out a lot of money, that we wouldn't be at risk of running out of money. So this will show you a couple tables. These tables are different because what they're going to be doing, this is a 4% original distribution of the balance as of the 1st of 1970. And every year, there's nothing to do with inflation here, because the person who's using these pages may have 50% more than they need in investments, 100% more than they need in investments, in which case you don't have to adjust for inflation. And because you already got more than you need. I want you to notice that with that 4%, and you look at a 60-40, you start with a $40,000 distribution. Then because the market went up, 42, then 45, then 48, then 45, because the market went down, and then 40, and then 46, and then 52, and then 49, and then 50. And by the way, at the bottom of the page, you would be taking out the last year, you took out $346,000. At the end of 30 years, you're taking out $274,000. The defense is this: when the market goes down, you take out less because you're taking out a percentage of the balance of the last year. Okay? That's a big deal. It may not sound like a big deal, but let me show it to you here. And I will just note here again, we have the 5%. Oh, here, this is a great example. S&P 500 again, 5% now instead of 4%. Remember what happened last time? Below about here, there was nothing. You were broke. Now, not only is there something there because you had the defense to adjust your distribution according to wherever the market is at the end of each year. I mean, if somebody has $1 million and a need for $40,000, and they have to adjust that because they don't have any more than that, then they're on kind of a tightrope. They got to be careful. But let's say that same person has a cost of living of the same 40, but they have 2 million. Well, they can take out 5%. Easy. In fact, there are some people, if they're depending on how their health is, might take out 6% because they have way more money than they need. But I want you to notice every one of these columns is making it to the bottom and leaving lots of money left over for others. The total distributions over $10 million. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the 60-40, over $10 million with about $8 million left over, starting with $1 million. Now, older people are saying, well, who cares about 56 years or 54 years? Well, I will tell you from my position, if you're a 40-year-old, you likely are looking at about that for the rest of your life. So these numbers, I think, are meaningful. Here's that 6%. Here's the S&P 500 making it to the bottom of the page. You can look at these numbers later if you're really interested. Here's the two-fund strategy. Let's see what the 60-40 got to with the S&P 500. It got down to 4.5 million, and it distributed 9 million. Okay, 4.5 and 9 versus 23. Wow, 23 million. That is the year-end balance. It's almost 24 million and 20 million distributed. Oversaving is absolutely huge. Target date funds. I really believe for the majority of people who really don't want to make any decisions in their life, target date funds are the best investment ever developed because it's the only investment that is built to adjust to your age, so that when you begin, you will likely be almost all, if not all, equities. And by the time you're 60, they will have automatically adjusted your portfolio to be maybe 50-50 stocks and bonds, maybe 60-40. Most money that's going in target date into 401k plans today are going into target date funds. There are big differences between them. But the beauty is all you have to do is make one decision for the rest of your life as an investor. Truly, that is really it. And that is approximately the year you want to retire. And what it will do, it will know then what is the appropriate amount of equity and fixed income for you. And by the way, you are not really the target. The target is the average of all of yous. And when you get to retirement, they will continue to manage. And as you age, they will put you more and more in bonds and less in equities. And those are important decisions. And they come in 5-year increments, so that you could choose 2060, you could choose 2070 or 2060. So if you're retiring some age in between, I would suggest you go for the latter year for the purposes of the target date fund. You can do it with virtually maybe $1,000 minimum in some funds, but in most cases, zero minimum. They are the default investment in most 401k plans for people who are automatically being opted in. And you get professional stock diversification, and you get professional asset allocation, diversification management, and they're cheap. Here are two well-known target date funds, both no loads, both based on index funds. I go back to all those series of steps that we talked about early on, the defensive steps, index versus active. Well, I certainly wouldn't want to recommend a target date fund that is made up of actively managed equity and fixed equity in particular, of funds. Because all a target date fund does, it owns a certain amount in US equities, a certain amount in international, a certain amount in large, a certain amount in small value growth. They do a lot of that asset class diversification, not much, but more than the individual would likely, particularly the individual who's not seen this presentation, would likely use. Notice the difference between these two target date funds. Here I am out here, basically at 15 years after age 65. They would have me 30% in equities. I said earlier we're 50%. Nothing wrong with 30. It's just very low risk. And for people who had more than enough, I would certainly be more comfortable, or think it would be more appropriate to use BlackRock, because you can see here that it is 40%, and that 40% makes a difference. But there's another time that that difference in equity